Marcus Webb was 39 years old the morning his wife took his two children and vanished into a silence that would last 3 years. He was a structural engineer with calloused hands and a 15-year-old pickup truck, a man who packed his own lunch and wore the same gray jacket until the elbows wore thin. His neighbors in Greensboro thought of him as Quiet Marcus, the one who waved but rarely stopped to talk, the one whose lights stayed on late while he worked at his kitchen table. His wife Danielle called him unambitious to her friends, and Marcus heard her once through a half-closed door and said nothing. He came home on a Tuesday in October to a house stripped bare, no furniture, no children's drawings on the refrigerator, no sound of his daughter's footsteps overhead. On the counter sat a single sheet of paper with 11 words and a bank notice showing $84,000 withdrawn from the account he'd built for his children's future. What Danielle never thought to ask, not once in 11 years of marriage, was what Marcus had been building in the quiet rooms she never bothered to enter. She believed she had taken everything that mattered and left him with nothing. She had no idea that the man she abandoned had spent 2 decades preparing for the kind of patience this would require. What happened next would cost Danielle everything she believed was safely beyond his reach. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the small house Marcus had bought with his own hands 11 years earlier, and he sat at the table with a mug of coffee cradled in both palms, watching the steam rise the way he had watched 1,000 mornings before. The house was quiet now in the way it had been quiet for 3 years, but the silence had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a workspace. On the table in front of him lay a set of architectural drawings, the lines precise, the measurements exact, the kind of work he did for clients who had no idea the unassuming man across the desk owned a controlling stake in the firm that employed him. Marcus had laid the tile on this kitchen floor himself, each square set with a level and a careful hand, and his father's voice came back to him the way it always did when he worked with his hands. Tools were meant to work, not shine, the old man used to say, standing over a workbench in a garage that smelled of sawdust and motor oil. His father had been a millwright who never finished high school and never missed a day of work in 40 years, and he had raised Marcus alone after his mother passed, teaching him that a man's worth was measured in what he completed, not what he announced. Marcus had taken that lesson and built a life around it, quietly, methodically, in the spaces between what people assumed about him. He remembered the first time he met Danielle, at a wedding where he'd been seated at the back table because he didn't know the couple well, and she had laughed at something he said and told him he was the most interesting, boring man she'd ever met. He had loved her for the way she made the world feel lighter, for the way she filled the rooms he tended to leave silent. For a long time, before the changes came slowly enough that he almost missed them, they had been something good. But the woman who laughed at that wedding had become a woman who tilted her phone away from him at dinner, who mentioned new friends he never met, who spoke of a future in which his name appeared less and less. He had said nothing then, only watched, only noted, the way his father had taught him to read a structure before deciding whether it could be saved. His sleeker phone, the one connected to accounts and people Danielle had never known existed, stayed secured in the inner pocket of his jacket where it had always been. Only his attorney and his financial advisor understood the full shape of what Marcus had spent 20 years constructing in silence. And on this October morning, 3 years after the house went empty, that second phone buzzed against his chest with a message he had been waiting a long time to receive. The message was from an investigator named Carl, a retired detective Marcus had hired 18 months earlier when the official channels stopped returning his calls. Marcus had filed every petition, hired every lawyer, followed every legal avenue a father could follow, and Danielle had stayed 3 steps ahead each time, moving across state lines, changing the children's last names, leaving false trails that dissolved the moment anyone touched them. But Carl had found something, and the message contained an address in a gated community outside Scottsdale, Arizona, along with a photograph of a woman stepping out of a luxury sedan in a driveway that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Marcus set the phone down on the architectural drawings and looked at the image for a long moment. His hands didn't shake. He recognized her immediately, though she had changed her hair and her clothes carried the unmistakable confidence of money that wasn't hers. Behind her, half visible in the photograph, was a man Marcus also recognized, a real estate developer named Trent Vasquez, whose name had appeared in the financial filings Marcus had been quietly tracking for 2 years. He did not feel the rage he might have expected. He felt the cold clarity of an engineer who has finally located the load-bearing flaw in a structure he intends to bring down. Marcus opened his laptop and began to cross-reference, pulling up files he had assembled over 36 patient months. And the pattern that emerged was worse and longer than he had imagined. Danielle had not simply left with the children and the $84,000. She had been planning her exit for nearly 2 years before she walked out, siphoning money in increments small enough to escape notice, opening accounts in names that traced back through Trent Vasquez to a web of properties built on borrowed identities and forged guarantees. The $84,000 had been the seed money for a life she intended to build, on the assumption that Marcus would never have the resources or the will to find her. He moved through the documents with the same deliberate calm that defined everything he did, photographing screens, downloading statements, forwarding records to a folder his attorney could access. Every date lined up. Every transfer told the same story, and the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that Danielle had attached herself and Marcus's children to a man whose entire fortune was built on fraud waiting to collapse. 3 years of betrayal mapped itself across his screen in transaction histories and property deeds, and somewhere in that data was the precise mechanism by which everything she had stolen would return to him. Marcus closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and made a single call to the one person who had been waiting 3 years for him to make it. "Go ahead and start the filing," he said softly. "We have what we need." The office of Patricia Ellison occupied the top floor of a building Marcus had helped design, though the brass nameplate in the lobby would never tell anyone that. She was a family law attorney in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back severely and a reputation for never losing a custody case she chose to take. And she had taken Marcus's the moment she understood what kind of client he was. She spread the documents across her conference table now, sorting them into stacks with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. "The interstate parental relocation," she said without looking up, "is itself a violation of 3 separate orders. The financial concealment is fraud, and her association with Mr. Vasquez gives us standing to demonstrate an unsafe environment for the children." She finally raised her eyes to Marcus. "In 30 years, she said, I have rarely seen a parent build a case this complete and this patient. You did everything right. You waited until waiting became a weapon." Marcus said nothing, only nodded, but something in his chest settled at the words. Patricia tapped one of the stacks. "The hardest part is done," she said. "The children are the priority. Everything else follows from that." Some things, Marcus thought as he gathered his coat, were worth the patience to build right. That evening, Marcus drove to a modest house on the edge of Greensboro, where his Aunt Loretta had lived for 40 years, the woman who had helped his father raise him after his mother died. She was 81 now, sharp as a blade, and she sat him down at her kitchen table and put a plate of food in front of him before she would let him speak. She had never trusted Danielle, had said so quietly at the wedding and louder afterward, and when Marcus told her what Carl had found, she folded her hands and looked at him with eyes that had seen every kind of trouble a long life could hold. "You know what your daddy would say," she told him. "A man who chases his anger runs out of breath before he gets where he's going. But a man who walks steady gets there with something left to use." She reached across the table and gripped his hand. "Those are your babies, Marcus. You bring them home. And you do it the way your daddy taught you. Quiet, clean, final." Marcus held his aunt's hand and felt 3 years of waiting harden into something useful. When you moved too early, his father used to say, you got a lie. When you waited, you got the truth. The counter-evidence came together over the following weeks like a structure rising from its foundation. Carl and a forensic accountant, Patricia, traced the full architecture of Trent Vasquez's fraud, and what they found would have impressed Marcus if it hadn't endangered his children. Vasquez had built a development empire on falsified appraisals and investor money he reported as personal equity, moving funds through shell entities to disguise a debt load that any honest audit would have exposed in an afternoon. He had used Danielle's clean name and Marcus's children's residence to anchor mortgages he had no intention of repaying. The $84,000 Danielle had stolen had been folded into a down payment on the Scottsdale house, which meant that the home she believed was her sanctuary was in fact a liability waiting for a single creditor to pull the thread. Marcus reviewed the forensic report at his kitchen table and the engineer in him recognized the shape of demolition. You didn't need a degree to see when a building was condemned. You only needed to know where the supports had been cut. He forwarded the complete file to Patricia, who in turn coordinated with attorneys in Arizona and a federal contact who had been quietly interested in Vasquez for some time. Through all of it, Marcus kept the rhythm of his ordinary life. He went to work. He reviewed drawings. He answered the phone in the same even voice he always used, and no one at the firm or in his neighborhood had any idea that the quiet engineer was bringing a small empire to its knees. Real power, he had learned long ago, operated in quiet rooms. Preparation was the work. Everything visible was only the moment the work became undeniable. By the time the legal machinery had aligned, it was a courtroom in Maricopa County, rather than a restaurant or a porch where the reckoning came. And Marcus arrived in the same gray jacket he had worn for years, carrying nothing but a single folder. Danielle was already seated when he entered beside an expensive attorney Vasquez had paid for, and she wore the confident expression of a woman who believed she had outrun her past for good. His daughter and son were not in the room. Patricia had arranged for them to be safe, supervised, and waiting, but their absence sat in Marcus's chest like the weight that gave a building its strength. Danielle's confidence held until Patricia began to lay the documents on the table, one by one, the way a builder sets stones. The relocation violations, the forged financial records, the withdrawals traced to the day and the dollar, and then the Vasquez file, the federal interest, the condemned structure of the life Danielle had attached herself to. Her attorney went quiet first. Then her face began to change in measurable stages, confidence draining into confusion, and confusion hardening into fear. Patricia spoke without raising her voice, stating plainly what Danielle had never thought to ask. The man across from her was not the unambitious husband she had described to her friends. He was the principal owner of the engineering firm whose buildings she had walked past her entire marriage. A man of independent means who had chosen a modest life because the work mattered more than the display. He had not lacked the resources to find her. He had chosen to wait until waiting could bring his children home for good. Danielle tried, in the last moments, to do what she had always done. She reached for the soft voice, the trembling appeal, the claim that she had only done it for the children, that Marcus had never understood her, that surely they could find a way forward as a family. The words dissolved in the air of that room. It was her own mother who had flown in from North Carolina after Marcus quietly paid for her ticket and told her the truth, who ended it. "You took those babies from their father," the old woman said from the back of the room, her voice like a closing door. "I raised you better, and you will not stand here and pretend." Marcus stood. He gathered his single folder. He looked at the woman he had once loved across the wreckage of everything she had built on a lie, and he spoke for the first time since entering. "I'm not angry, Danielle," he said. "I'm clear. Those are different things. You should have asked what I was building." Then he walked out, and he did not look back, and the room remained silent behind him as the paperwork on the table mapped the precise shape of a ruin she had constructed with her own hands. 18 months had passed like water by the time the last of it settled. Marcus stood on the back deck of a house outside Asheville, a house with bamboo floors he had installed himself and a workshop in the garage that smelled of sawdust and motor oil the way his father's had. His daughter, 14 now, was inside doing homework at a table he had built, and his son, 11, was in the yard with a basketball. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening filling a home that had once been silent. The custody had been granted in full. The children lived with him now, and the wound of 3 lost years was healing in the slow, steady way that real things heal. He had a new partner, a pediatric physical therapist named Renee, who had asked careful questions about his children before she ever asked about him. A woman who didn't perform and didn't push, who sat on the deck some evenings and let the quiet be quiet. The firm had expanded under his guidance into a foundation that funded engineering scholarships for kids raised by single parents, and the first building bearing its name had broken ground that spring. Of Danielle, he heard little, and what he heard he registered without satisfaction. Trent Vasquez had pleaded out on federal fraud charges, and the Scottsdale house had been seized by creditors before the keys were cold. Danielle, stripped of the money and the name and the man she had bet everything on, lived now in a rented apartment and worked an administrative job 2 towns over. Her own mother had spoken to her only once since the courtroom, and her circle of borrowed friends had evaporated the moment the money did. Marcus did not gloat. There was no investment left in her at all. Bitterness, he had decided long ago, required ongoing effort on behalf of people who no longer deserved the labor. He pressed a row of tomato seedlings into the soil of a garden bed he had framed by hand, the evening light catching the dew on the leaves, and from inside the house came his daughter's laughter at something her brother had said. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.